Oh my God. What am I doing? Hello, welcome to Just Thinking Out Loud. My name is Desi-Rae. I'm speaking today with Cory J. Clark. She is a social psychology assistant professor at Durham University in the UK. She has an interest in moral judgment, punishment, free will and belief, political bias, and one thing I'm not super sure of, which is motivated cognition. And I found her because I saw a tweet where she was speaking about how liberals wanted to censor information that portrayed women, Islam, and blacks in a negative light compared to men, Christianity, and whites. And so when I saw that, I was like, yes, I'm very interested in a topic like this because I do think that people are a bit nicer to certain groups that they're trying to pick up for. And then I went a bit more, looked at her Twitter feed and went on her website, and I saw that she does research that had to do with bias and tribalism, specifically in the realm of politics. And I wanted her to come and talk to me about those things. So I'm also going to ask her to introduce herself to you, but that is how I found her.
First, thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation. So I'm Cory Clark, and I'm an assistant professor at Durham University. I call myself a moral and a political psychologist, and a lot of what I study regarding politics is political bias. So how people are more charitable toward political information that they want to believe than information that opposes their desired beliefs about their political in-group. And that's kind of spawned off into a whole new thing on liberal bias and some of the things liberals do that actually conservatives don't do as much. Maybe we'll probably talk about that. And then, moral judgment as well, and kind of how we view human moral responsibility and how we view humans as sort of like special moral creatures that are dissimilar to other kinds of animals.
Okay. Well, could we first start talking about bias, I guess, and the research you've done there? I know of two particular pieces of research that you have listed on your website, and one was about bias being bipartisan, and then one was also about tribalism, even though there's some interlap there. And I wanted you to talk about like how many people were studied so people get an idea of how good the research is, in my opinion, and like how you evaluate, how you measure the different things you were studying. So kind of get into the technical bit as well, and not just the conclusions.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll start with the political bias meta-analysis. So first I should explain what a bias study is like. What we do when we're trying to determine whether someone is biased is we present two independent groups of people with the exact same kind of information, and then we just manipulate whether it's going to have some kind of conclusion that they would like or they wouldn't like. So a non-political example of this would be, for example, to have people read an essay and then say it was written by a man or a woman. And do they evaluate the essay as a better essay when it was written by a man than a woman, or a woman than a man? And if the two groups differ, then we say they have a bias on that thing. That would be a gender bias on how they evaluate essays. With political bias, there are different kinds of, I think there are three types. So one is you would read about a policy. And in both conditions, they read the exact same policy, and then we say either a Democrat or a Republican supports the policy. And what you generally find is that Democrats like the policy better if a Democrat proposes it than if a Republican proposes it, and the reverse for Republicans, even though it's the exact same policy. You also have types where maybe you're evaluating a moral behavior. So a Republican politician or a Democratic politician did some immoral behavior. How bad is that behavior? They're evaluating the exact same behavior. And if Democrats treat and Republicans treat the information differently, depending on who committed the immoral infraction, then we would say that that's a bias. So essentially what we did, a meta-analysis takes tons of studies like that, tons of studies that have participants evaluate the exact same piece of information and then just manipulate whether it's their own group or the out group that proposed it or that did the behavior. We combine all of those studies together and then look at whether, on average, there's a difference between liberals and conservatives and their tendency to do that, their tendency to be more favorable toward information when it supports their group's interests than that exact same piece of information when it opposes their group's interests. So I think we ended up including, I think it was around 50, maybe 55 studies total. So I think it had at least many thousands of participants across the 55 studies. I don't actually remember the exact.
I think I wrote this down. I think it's 18,000. Okay. The one 18,000 at least biases bipartisan paper.
Yeah,
I took that from your abstract. So that one was 18,000. Okay. And these were participants online, or was it in the U.S.?
It was so we did restrict it to in the U.S., but mainly because most of these studies were conducted in the U.S. There aren't really systematic studies of political bias in other countries that we came across, so we didn't have to exclude many studies for that purpose. But this was in the U.S., and there were all kinds of participants. So some were online, some were in person, some were students, some were adults. And we looked at the differences by different groups, so by students and adults, and I don't think there were big differences there. So it's all kinds of people, and yeah, I guess around 18,000, so a lot of participants. And what we ended up finding, and what was kind of interesting about this project, is I think none of us really knew what we were going to find. I think we thought either there'll be no difference or conservatives will be more biased, because there's a lot of research in social psychology saying conservatives are terrible and they're biased in all these different ways. But we ended up finding that there was no difference between the two groups, and that liberals and conservatives are pretty similar in their tendency to be more favorable toward the information that they want to believe and more resistant of information they don't want to believe.
I think I read somewhere that as when I was researching what you were doing, that there are certain, I don't know what the word is, cognitive traps or things that people will do when they're thinking, when they hear certain information. Could you give, say, examples of like a cognitive fallacy that someone would participate in if they were, say, viewing information? Like, could you give like a specific example?
Do you mean like a heuristic they would use, or?
I mean, say that I was reading a paper in the New York Times, which I think is very left-leaning. When I'm reading it, maybe I would skip parts of the information that I actually agree with, because of the source that it's coming from, because I don't like, and I personally don't really like the New York Times. Are there examples that you can point to things that people do say like that when they're taking in information?
Yeah, so there are different kinds of, I guess I would call them biases, or they're different, maybe different levels. So at different stages of the information processing sequence that allow you to come to the conclusions you want to believe. So I think what you're talking about, we would call that selective exposure, although in your case it would be selective non-exposure. So right. It's just the tendency for people to want to seek out information that they think is going to confirm their beliefs and avoid information that they think will oppose their beliefs. So this happens all over, like it can happen in your media consumption. So you're more likely to read the news that you think is going to support your beliefs and not read the news that you think might oppose your beliefs. But you do this with your friends as well. You be friends with people who agree with you. We're having this conversation right now, I think probably because we agree with each other on a lot of things. Right. So this is an example of selective exposure right here. So it happens in your social environments as well. And so you face this immediate challenge that you're not even confronting the information that might change your beliefs. But then if somehow that information does get to you, you're resistant to that information. So it's sort of like a two layers of avoidance that really prevents people from getting information that might make them change their minds on some of their political beliefs. Okay.
So would you say that that's just one example of something that people do, or that's the main one that people would participate in? Because
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm trying to figure out like what other examples would we be likely to participate in depending on what our tribe is? And I did write down that for your second study, you described something called pro-tribe cognitive tendencies. Like what?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's related to what I was just bringing up, but I think it might be. And could you explain what that means more?
Mm-hmm. So when I say pro-tribe cognitive tendencies, I do mean these types of biases. So the selective exposure and then biased evaluation of information, which is what the meta-analysis was on. But I also mean other things. So, for example, in-group favoritism, so just liking your group more than other groups. What else would I categorize? It's complicated because some things sort of fall in the domains of bias and others don't. So, for example, maybe you know what, I might say that those might be the main ones. So, selective exposure, I think, biased evaluation of information, and then just general tendencies to like your in-group, to trust your in-group, to agree with them more, and to kind of cut them slack when they do things that they maybe shouldn't do.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that kind of what you said so far gives an idea of what you found for bias and tribalism. You know, we have our tribes, and when it comes to politics, we're likely to favor our side and reinforce what we think already for our side. So that's that. That's not really surprising, I guess. Would you say that your research will have an impact on what people believe about, say, conservatives versus liberals? Because you said that you were almost expecting conservatives to be more biased because that's what we hear about. But it was more that actually both sides are biased, or you'd say anyone really, depending on the tribe, is biased. Do you think that this will shift the rhetoric around bias depending on what side of the political spectrum that people are on?
That's a really good question, and I hope so. So there has been some resistance. So it was kind of interesting. We submitted our meta-analysis, and before it even was published, we didn't post a preprint, but word had gotten out about our results. And another scholar who, his name is John Jost, he's sort of well known for conducting these really big studies. He's done meta-analyses. He's written many review papers, showing all of the sort of like flaws of conservative thinking. So all of the ways that conservatives have these sort of cognitive tendencies that should make them more biased. And so before it was even published, he had submitted a critique to the journal, and the editor reviewed us and was like, "This has never happened before. Oh. We've never had a critique submitted before we even had a chance to publish the original." But anyway, so they wrote a critique. I think probably, so this was John Barron and John Jost. I don't think they were persuaded at all whatsoever. I think they would say our results are probably just flawed. So it certainly isn't changing everyone's. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there is a certain irony to that, but yeah. It certainly hasn't changed everyone's views. But I think it has changed some people's views. And I think there are just people who are more just kind of open to the possibilities that, you know, they could be equally biased. Maybe even liberals are more biased. And I think those are a lot of the people I end up interacting with, probably because they're doing selective exposure with me, exposing themselves to the information I'm providing. But I think it has. I think when I talk to people about this, a lot of people seem very interested in these results, and they seem to think it coheres with their intuitions about the world. And it coheres with my intuitions about the world. If you look at liberals and conservatives, they both seem pretty tribal to me. And I think particularly for people who aren't experts, people who don't already have really strong opinions, people who don't study political bias, basically, I think those are the people that are persuaded by these kinds of findings. precisely because they're sort of more open to the evidence because they don't already have a really strong opinion or a really strong preference regarding the difference there.
Mm-hmm. I am curious about what were the critiques, like what did they say were the flaws? I mean, you could say that whether or not you agree that this was actually a valid critique, but what did these two other researchers say about your meta-analysis?
Well, I'll give you the best one because there's one that is a very good critique and that's pretty hard to address. So one is that these aren't biases at all, that they're sort of like rational heuristics people use. So if I'm a liberal and I'm reading about a policy and I know that a Democrat supports that policy, then it makes sense to like the policy more than if a Republican supports it, because I know I can trust the Democrat and that provides me some information. You know, if I know that someone I trust supports a policy, then it makes sense to trust the policy more. And so I guess it's not an argument against bias per se. It's an argument about the rationality of what we would call the bias. So it's a really hard problem to do. We think that most of these studies included in our paper are probably not super vulnerable to that criticism. For example, there's one where they're counting ballots, and there's like a sort of ambiguous check mark in a ballot box, and the ballot's for your guy or the other guy. And people say it counts as a legitimate vote when it's their own political party then opposing. So that one, it's hard to sort of justify rationally how that is something that you ought to do if you're trying to come to the right conclusion. And the other thing is we've asked sort of general people what they think about these biases. They all agree that they're biases. I've conducted studies where I look at these biases within groups instead of between. So instead of presenting people with one condition that either like a pro-liberal condition or a pro-conservative condition, instead giving participants both conditions. And when you give participants both conditions, they treat them more similarly, which tells you they don't think it's rational to treat them differently. Tells you that they kind of are aware that it doesn't make sense to treat the same policy differently if it comes from two different politicians, one that's your guy and one that's the opposing guy, right? So, but it is a valid criticism and it's hard to deal with, and we've tried to deal with it a variety of different ways. And I think really a big part of the issue is that these are the kinds of things that liberals and conservatives accuse each other all the time of being biased or being hypocrites. So even if we want to say, no, all of these tendencies are completely rational, they are still problematic. And they create a lot of political conflict. So I think it's worth being concerned about. Right. And it's worth pointing out that everyone's doing it. Everyone's being hypocritical.
So you concluded that tribalism seems inherent and that everyone is doing it. But would you say that things have gotten worse in the political sphere, even though these tendencies have always existed? And is there a way to tone it down a bit, the polarization, even understanding that we've always had these tendencies and we might always have them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of people think it has gotten worse. What wouldn't have gotten worse is the tendency, as you point out. Like we've always had these tendencies; they're part of our evolution. We are tribal people, we are in-group people, and that's been a good thing. It's good for people to support their in-group. So that's probably not changing. But what can change are different factors that are more likely to exacerbate these biases. And I don't know for sure whether those have gotten worse. I know it seems that sort of out-group hatred, liberals seem to hate conservatives more than ever, and conservatives seem to hate liberals more than ever. And I don't know exactly why that is. Um, in terms of making it better, I think the best defense, honestly, is just getting better information. Because one of the things that makes biases worse, and this is maybe the thing I find the most fascinating about political bias, is that we know that ambiguity exacerbates bias. So the more ambiguous an issue is, the more people are biased about it, because the more biased they can be about it, because no one knows the truth. So you can't hold the gun to someone's head and be like, here are the data, because we don't have the data. So I think the more we can get good information that, people are forced to confront reality, the more, if you could show definitively, here's a policy, we've tested the policy, it's an ineffective policy, then people would have to change their minds. So we would hope that that would continue to happen. But of course, people do resist scientific evidence that opposes their beliefs. But I think the more of it, the bigger the mountain, the harder it is to ignore. So that's what I'm hopeful for the future. But we'll see. There might just be so like one good example is same-sex marriage. So it used to be that conservatives were pretty opposed to same-sex marriage and liberals supported it. And I think people started to realize more and more that it wasn't going to be as problematic. It wasn't going to be a catastrophe for marriage. It didn't appear to harm children. And I think that's a case where more information led people to change their minds. And now mostly people agree that we'll let same-sex couples get married and that's fine. But we need that to happen on more issues. We need better information. And so hopefully science just keeps working hard and providing information.
And I mean, I know this isn't on specific policies, but I think it's great that you're doing this kind of research and that we can talk about it and learn more about what's happening in society and maybe come up with solutions like you just suggested, even if they're super simple, like more information and evidence that people can't ignore. I saw on Twitter recently a few people talking about how conservatives tend to follow liberals more and are expose themselves more to, I guess, arguments from the liberal side than the other side. Is this true, or would you say that this is true, or is this just conservatives trying to say that they're like more open?
I'm actually curious, do you recall who the authors were?
It wasn't a paper. It was just people. It was just conjecture, like people saying that this is how they feel. I didn't see a study on it, but I don't know if you can clarify or maybe bring some light to that.
So there have been studies on Twitter behavior between liberals and conservatives, and I don't know the actual data, like what the actual results were off the top of my head, but I do have an image in my mind, and this is, I think, Jay Van Babel's background on his Twitter thing, which is tweets and retweets between liberals and conservatives. And anyway, it looks to me like that's not true. It looks to me as though liberals and conservatives are both similarly echo chambery, liberals follow other liberals and conservatives follow other conservatives. So I don't know that that's true. It could be, but I'm not sure. And I suspect it's hard because a lot of media figures are liberal and a lot of academics are liberal. And so a lot of people, I don't know if anyone's done this analysis, but somebody should do it if they haven't. I'm guessing liberals have more followers in general because they're media figures and because they're academics. So the most famous, professors tend to have a lot of followers, and most famous journalists. So I could imagine that liberals might have more followers in general, and in that case, they probably would have more conservative followers as well. But I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, that's okay to not be sure, and I was just wondering about that. You did mention earlier, and that's sort of related to what I just asked, that liberals tend to do certain things that conservatives don't do. Could you go into that a bit?
Mhm.
Because I have no idea thinking in my head. Because I do agree from what you're saying that liberals and conservatives probably are both equally biased. So I'm wondering what the difference might be there, even though they're similar on that specific trait.
Mm-hmm. So my colleague Bo Weingard and I have identified what we think is the largest liberal bias. And this is something that liberals seem to have, that conservatives don't seem to have. And it's related to, I guess, how you found me, which was that censorship tweet I put out. That was data I collected with him. In that study, we had participants read a passage that either said, what was it exactly? Oh, it was men would have evolved to be better leaders than women, or women evolved to be better leaders than men, or blacks have higher IQs than whites, and part of that is genetically caused, or whites have higher IQs than blacks, and part of that is genetically caused, or Islam incites violence, or Christianity incites violence. So people read one of those different conditions, and then we asked people how much they would censor that information. Do they think those books should be removed from the library? And what we found was, whereas conservatives were pretty much equally non-supportive of censorship regardless of the findings, liberals consistently want to censor information that appears to disadvantage what they perceive to be vulnerable groups. So in this case, it's women, blacks, and Muslims. And we've replicated this a number of times with other research as well. We see that liberals are more biased about, and this is actually a discussion we had, what should we call them? Should we call them victims groups or disadvantaged groups or low status
I didn't
groups?
come up with a better
You
term.
I was hoping you were going to help me out.
I know it's very hard to know what to say, because anything you say will sound kind of negative, but that also reflects the reality of how these groups are being put in a negative light. So I keep trying to think of it. Sorry.
Yeah, we've tried a bunch of different terms, and every time we pick a term, someone says, use this term instead, and so we use that term. And then someone else would be like, why would you use that term? Use this term. And so we've shuffled around. So I don't know. We call them, sometimes we say low status, disadvantaged victims groups. But anyway, vulnerable groups. Maybe vulnerable groups is a better term.
Maybe, sorry. I want to keep going, but maybe it could be something that's outside of the regular discourse around the topic, which would mean that it's a bit harder for people to understand what you're talking about, but that would remove connotations that already exist in people's minds. I don't know what exactly, but maybe it could be something that just doesn't have a already existing connotation when we hear it. I don't know what that is, but yeah.
We've been thinking about it, but it's been tricky. But maybe we'll keep, one of these days a reviewer will suggest a good term, and then we'll adopt that. So we've replicated this now quite a few times, and it's been converging with other evidence from other researchers who haven't been looking at this problem specifically, but they've found similar data. So I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he's a very good researcher. Nour, N-O-U-R, Ktili, K-T-E-I-L-Y. He has a paper showing that whereas conservatives, I think it was tweeting about successes in the Olympics or gold medals in the Olympics, and whereas conservatives were equally likely to, or more equally likely to, tweet about a white person or a black person or a man or a woman, liberals were much more likely to want to advance or to share the successes of black people or women who won gold medals. There have been, similar findings where this one was interesting because this was I think in the early maybe 2008, I'm thinking, but it was a while ago, and I don't think really people didn't pay much attention to it. But they had liberals or conservatives read a classic, I think it was the trolley problem or the footbridge problem. So would you kill one person to save 5 people? Although I think in this study they did save 100 people, and whereas conservatives were equally likely to kill a black or a white man to save 100 people, liberals were more willing to kill the white man to save 100. So and now there are a handful of studies like this where we see that whereas conservatives treat demographic groups more similarly, liberals are now treating the groups that they perceive to be vulnerable better than the advantaged group. And in fact, Zach Goldberg posted a graph. Do you know who Zach Goldberg is? He's on Twitter.
No, I'm. It's not ringing a bell, but maybe I've seen something from this person. No, I don't know.
He just pumps out a lot of interesting data on Twitter. He doesn't publish any of it yet, so it drives me crazy. But
yeah.
But he tweets a lot of really interesting data, and he found that white liberals now have an racial and ethnic outgroup preference. So white liberals prefer other ethnicities and races over their own. And as far as we know, like, no group of people has ever had that before. Like, everyone is pro in-group on their race and their ethnicity, but liberals now, I think these are feeling thermometers. So they report liking other races better than their own, which is just really interesting. Weird. Because you think, like, could we get to a place where we just, like, treat people equally? Right. And it seems that conservatives are doing that more now, and liberals have now overcorrected. And I've had different conversations with liberals where some people will say, some people will say, well, that's a good thing. We should be overcorrecting. So there's an argument to be made for that. But then other people just deny it. And that tells me that they think that it's probably not okay to kind of reverse discrimination and treat groups differently based on their race or their sex or whatever demographic characteristic. But this, I'm diving deeper into this problem, and it appears to be an extremely robust finding.
Okay.
So it'll keep coming. I'm going to keep it coming.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's something that I personally really don't like, that the trying to protect vulnerable groups to the point where they're treated more favorably. I think it's another form of racism, which I don't actually think is like, they're like, okay, well, this kind of racism is okay because it's helpful, but I think it's not helpful, because I think it's like the way it comes out is different standards, in my opinion. And I think that when you have different standards, usually meaning lower for people, then you're setting the bar lower for them in terms of achievement, which I absolutely hate. And something too I just want to point out is that you were saying people tend to have the norm is that people have in-group preference for their ethnicity or race. And I think that for me, where I'm from, in my specific environment, I had never considered myself having an in-group preference for my race. I wasn't very much aware of my race, and a lot of people, not aware as in I don't know it exists, but it wasn't, like, if I compare it to the awareness in the US of race, it's almost non-existent, like, if I just compare because of the extreme. But I do have preference for my ethnicity, which doesn't necessarily mean being tied to race. And I just feel like,
you said you were from Jamaica,
right? And I consider, like, myself Jamaican, which isn't tied to race. So I just think that for a lot of Americans, they're almost not aware that can exist, because for them, like, they just see race. So I just want to point that out.
Do you mean in terms of having sort of like a national identity as, like, a person in the United States?
National, or it could just be community oriented, which if you extend that goes to national. So you could say national, but I don't necessarily mean national. I mean like people I went to school with, and people when I was younger, I used to go to church, and, you know, like, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I guess I just want to put that in there, because I feel like a lot of these conversations come from the specific point of view of the U.S., and I think it's not necessarily the same. I know it's not necessarily the same everywhere else.
Yeah. The U.S. is just such an interesting case because it has so many different racial groups, and I suspect that's and also, like, a large proportion of different racial groups, as opposed to other countries that might have like 1% of a different race or something. The U.S. is,
Right.
I think, going to be minority white in the very near future. But yeah, it's there's a lot of debate about how problematic the U.S.'s focus on race is. I think it's probably problematic. But you do get a lot of this from liberals now kind of making it a thing again when it wasn't. I think it was going away,
Right.
and now it's come back, stronger than ever. Granted, I don't know. I haven't been alive that long, but it does seem to be becoming a bigger problem.
Yeah. I was going to say, I've been in the U.S. since 2010, and I've seen it increase, and I've not been here that long. So I've definitely seen like an increase in the focus on that in like almost 9 years. So, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting time to be alive.
Yeah. So I just want to sort of get to the other things I wanted to mention. Apart from focusing on tribalism and bias, you were also focused on free will and the attribution of free will to people because of the want to punish them for something that they did. Does that connect with political bias and tribalism? Like, is there a intersection there where people would want to? You could go ahead.
Yeah, there has been. There has been. That's not how it started. I think I was actually studying this free will stuff before I really got into a lot of my political research. But there has been. So we find that when somebody wants to punish someone, they attribute them more free will. They're more likely to deny kind of scientific explanations for behavior. So they are more likely to say neuroscience research is unimportant or doesn't matter. And I believe this is true probably of genetic causes as well. People want to blame a person. They want there to be like this agent who's completely responsible for their behavior, that chooses their own behavior. And we find that that there are sort of motivated tendencies here. So liberals are more likely to attribute free will to a conservative immoral actor, and conservatives are more willing to attribute free will to a liberal immoral actor. And I have a paper that's under review right now where we say that potentially one reason conservatives believe more in free will in general is because they have stronger tendencies to moralize. So conservatives see more things as morally wrong. They're more punitive than liberals, and they also believe more in free will. And we suggest the possibility that perhaps the reason they have this robust belief in free will is because they have more need to punish people and blame people. Yeah, so that paper's under review right now, so we'll see how it goes, if people like the argument or not, because it's kind of a tricky. You can't really measure what causes a belief that people have already, so we have to manipulate it in these small situations, but that's what the data look like to us. And we found that conservatives moralize even when they're looking at faces or personality traits or things. They're more likely to say things are bad, people are bad, or that being different ways are wrong. So it's kind of just like a personality difference.
Yeah, this is kind of going away from your research, but I think we've mostly covered that. Do you think that a lot of these... Oh, wait, there's one more thing I wanted to ask you. How do moderates and people who are in the middle fit in here? And like, are their biases the same, or like, do they somehow fluctuate between, like, how do they fit into this conversation about bias and tribalism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's hard to do moderates because, so that experimental design I was talking about where we give people information that should support their beliefs or oppose their beliefs, there isn't an obvious way to do that with moderates, right?
Right.
Because they don't have a candidate, for example. They don't, they tend to be sort of in the middle on different issues. So if you wanted to pick like gun control or something, what would a moderate position be? Well, we should restrict it somewhat. It would be a kind of a flexible. So the trouble there is it's hard to manipulate. It's hard to measure bias for moderates specifically. But what you can do is look at how the bias flips down the ideological spectrum. So in the studies where we were manipulating race or sex and finding that liberals are more biased about those issues than conservatives, moderates look more like conservatives. So moderates don't have as strong of biased tendencies on those issues as liberals, but so it's probably exactly what you think. They're like halfway in between the other two.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of research showing that it's really the extremes, the people at the ends of the spectrum, people who identify as very liberal and very conservative, who have the strongest biases. And that's what we found as well, in terms of whether people treat race differently or sex differently. The more extreme liberal you become, the bigger this difference is. We had a paper where we were kind of arguing that liberals have adopted what we call selective blank slatism, but maybe there are better terms for that. But it's just essentially the idea that there aren't genetic differences between groups if those differences are unfavorable toward the disadvantaged group. Right. And I saw you talk to James Damore, so this is kind of related to that conversation.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. So, for example, we haven't run the study, but I'm pretty confident that the study, actually, I might have these data now, but I haven't analyzed them yet. If you were to say men are more neurotic than women, or women are more neurotic than men, and it's partially genetically caused, I can be pretty sure that liberals would say, no, women are not more neurotic than men, and it's definitely not genetically caused. So we see this, that liberals are resistant to genetic explanations for group differences that appear to favor or justify potentially treating a disadvantaged group differently or worse, or that it might affect their outcomes. And as you get more extreme liberal, we call like the most extreme liberals progressives, the bigger this difference gets.
But it doesn't work the other way around. So if someone was arguing for a genetic cause behind something where groups weren't being seen unfavorably that they care about, they wouldn't be so against hearing that information. That's a question.
Do you mean if like the difference didn't really matter?
Yeah, so if it was, I don't know, something else that didn't bother them because the groups that they consider to be vulnerable weren't being portrayed in a negative light, they wouldn't be so offended at hearing that argument for a genetic causes behind it. I don't know of a specific example of that.
Yeah.
But
so in one paper that is currently under review, we have genetic differences in IQ between black and white and men and women. And liberals, and actually even conservatives, like it better I think for sex particularly, they're okay with the genetic explanation if it explains why women are smarter than men, but not why men are smarter than women. And I think that you would get the same thing. So if you did something like, let's take math ability, and if you said that men are better at math than women, and this is genetically caused, progressives would not like that. But if you said women have better verbal IQ than men, and it's genetically caused, they would probably be okay with that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, and I just was analyzing data right before you called me, and we see that a lot of these people who think that all differences between groups, whether it's between sexes, between races, or between even like homosexuals and heterosexuals, the more people think that a genetic cause would be bad, the more they would want to censor that information from other people, the more they think it's environmental. So
right. Right.
People fear that genetic differences between groups would be really bad for society. They don't want anyone to know if it's true. And those people say all of these differences are environmental as well. And those also tend to be the extreme liberals.
Right. Yeah. Would you say that there's I don't know if you know this because this isn't what you study, but I have heard this somewhere, that for conservatives versus liberals, that has a genetic component, actually, how people, I guess, perceive social issues.
Yeah, I do believe there is a genetic component to it. I don't know what the exact estimates are, and there is pretty compelling research that liberals and conservatives are different in some ways, genetically different. And so that's kind of interesting because it says that there should be differences between groups in a variety of different kinds of tendencies. But I don't exactly know how all of those differences would play out. I don't think really anyone probably knows how all of those differences would play out. And I also don't know whether liberals or conservatives would be more okay with that. I feel like liberals and conservatives would both be happy to hear that they're nothing like me. We don't even have the same genes.
Right. I mean, and then also, if it were most likely partly and not fully due to genetics, then they don't have to change their minds. They're like, oh, well, I think the way I think because it's genetic, so it would always be like an insurance policy for their ideas and arguments.
But then could they feel morally superior? Because they'd have to be like, oh, my morally superior beliefs are because of my genes.
Yeah, but then actually wouldn't it being genetic invalidate the argument because, well, you only think that because of your genes, and so it's not through moral enlightenment or reasoning that you came to this conclusion. It was just because who your parents were and the genes that they had and how things came together. So I would like to see more research done on that. I think we have to wrap up really soon. But one more thing I wanted to ask you was if there were other studies or research that you thought was very interesting that's not your own, that maybe you would want me or people listening or watching to hear about that are on the lines of what you study but not specifically your own research. You mentioned it, I think that Zach guy, but are there any...
Zach Goldberg.
Yeah.
Yeah, ones that are sort of related to... Ones that are related to what I'm talking about, and I think also even a little bit what you're talking about. There was Sidney Dupree and Susan Fisk have a paper that's interesting, showing that liberals display less competence to Black than white listeners. So they kind of patronize them in a way. Yeah, I know. I know. So there's some support for that point as well. They're related. A person on Twitter who often goes on, let's call them just threads, not rants, about these issues is Lee Jussum. And he talks about stereotype accuracy and how it seems that the social sciences, because the social sciences are mostly pretty progressive, they don't want to believe that stereotypes could possibly be based in reality and that they potentially could be useful. So that's related as well. I also think you should have Bo Weingart on your show as a guest. Do you know who Bo Weingart is?
No, I've just heard you mention her earlier, and it's one of those things. Yeah. I'm very bad with like names and like
I am too.
The same with like music or art. I will like see something I really like, but I could never tell you who made it. Like I'm like
that is interesting. I am the exact same way. Like I'll read a book and I couldn't tell you who the author was. It's a real problem because then people are like, oh, you're familiar with so-and-so. And I'm like, no, tell me what the finding is. And then I'll be able to tell you whether I'm familiar.
Yeah. Or people ask me like who my favorite somebody is. I'm like, I don't know, but I do like these specific songs. That happens to me a lot. So yeah, I will make a note of that, of Bo Weingart. And you briefly mentioned her, but maybe you want to go into why I would like to have her on my channel.
Well, it's a he, but he's just...
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was a she.
No, it's fine. No, he's my co-author on a lot of these papers, but he's also like pretty controversial because he has written stuff on race differences and whether they're potentially genetically caused, and he gets a lot of heat for it. But he also is extremely well read on the topic, probably better read than almost anyone. So I think he would just be interesting to talk to.
Yeah.
And it kind of coheres with a lot of what our work shows, is that really because the social sciences are so progressive that there are just certain things they don't want to talk about, certain things that if you find like the stereotype stereotype accuracy, if those type of empirical findings come out, then they don't get well received, they don't get cited, they're hard to publish. So it's kind of, and Bo and I are writing a paper now for Psych Inquiry where we're going to kind of talk about this and how has what we perceive to be the sort of progressive or liberal bias affected social science in general and the conclusions we've made, and have we been presenting the world with a biased set of information? And I think we probably have been.
Right.
So.
Yeah, actually, as you were saying this, I was just thinking to myself of, I have interest in, say, topics like race and IQ, but I don't really talk about them because I would just rather not receive the backlash. And when I first did a couple of times, it was because I didn't really know about it. I was just curious. And I wouldn't really say I'm censoring myself because I have greater interest in other things, and also sort of when I already have my conclusion on something, I don't necessarily need to go back and think about it all the time. But there's, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say like I censor myself at like a 2. So that's like, I don't really go into it very often. But I think it would be interesting to talk to people who in the media about doing research on their own like self-censorship due to what I would consider social, the need for social belonging and cohesion, because I don't want to disturb people to the point where, well, I can't talk about everything else that I'm interested in because it's one thing I would talk about would throw too many people off. So I think that would be an interesting thing to research as well.
That's so when the study that I just ran, that I was just analyzing the data for, we looked at various beliefs about genetic causes of group differences, and one of them was racial differences in IQ, and how much do you think it's genetically caused? And the more people think it's genetically caused, the more they report self-censorship.
Right.
So there's a negative relationship between the two, and I think that's true. But it's true for a lot of differences between groups. So if you think, for example, part of the gender wage gap or something is due to differences between men and women, people are more likely to censor their belief on that issue too. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting because it creates a kind of I think it creates a sort of sense, like a false consensus or something, that the people who are outspoken about it are the people who are like, no, there are no differences between groups. Men and women have all of the exact same strengths. There are no differences between races. Those are the people who speak freely about it, and then other people who think there could be differences between groups keep quiet themselves. And then if they also want to censor the information from other people, they don't want other people getting the information. So it's interesting, but I still have to go dig through the data, but I'll probably be writing those up in the next couple months or something. So
yeah, I'll definitely be looking forward to that. I know you have to go, but I just want to say that what you were just saying, I think also happened with Trump and his election, where people who were for him just kept quiet because it just wasn't worth it with like the people surrounding them to stir up too much trouble. So
I think that's absolutely right. The more people, if you ask them who they're voting for and they won't tell you, then you know they're voting for Trump.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because it just prevents people, like, I'm just like a fan of having conversations. So like whether you're right or wrong, like I didn't vote for Trump, but I love to talk to people who voted for Trump.
Yeah.
But it's hard to find them because they won't admit it, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's hard to understand the problem when you can't even find the people who have particular views.
Yeah, and the false consensus thing, I think, is an issue because there's like something going on in the media and the headlines and stuff like that, but it doesn't accurately reflect what's actually going on underneath. And I think that's definitely an issue, and maybe that's the way society has always worked. But it's at least interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming and talking to me. People who are listening or watching, you can go and find Cory at CoryJClark.com. And her Twitter handle is IMHARD Cory. I'm hardcore. And she
it's a play on I'm hardcore, but nobody gets it.
I totally didn't get it. I didn't get it either.
I think I thought it was a good idea when I was like 21, and now people are like, I'm hardcore, and I'm like, I'm hardcore. My name's Cory. I thought it was clever, but
when you explain it, it becomes more clever, but it just seems like an interesting handle before you understand that. Yeah, and I think she's really cool, and you can follow her work and research, and maybe if you're scientifically minded, you can actually take the time to go and read the papers as well, or you can just follow her Twitter feed and watch her interviews elsewhere, because she has done other interviews with people too. And you might also be interested in her work outside of this specific conservative liberal stuff, because she does the free will and motivation to punish people as well. And I think you did some stuff on prison incarceration stuff. I think I read something like that too. So there are other things too, other than what we've been discussing here. So thank you. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah. And I just want to remind my audience that my content is free, and if you would like to donate, it's just thinkingoutloud.tv/donate. I do undergo censorship, and I've been banned from various people, so these conversations aren't really easy to have, and if you want to keep them going, then think about contributing. Okay.
Where have you been banned from?
I was banned from PayPal, and I think YouTube was censoring me also, but they didn't. I don't.
For what? Did they tell you why?
PayPal never told me why. No, I actually don't know. Yeah, it's pretty crazy, and they did it twice, because I was like, maybe it was just a fluke. Let me just do it again, because I don't think I'm I don't think I'm that controversial. Like, I really don't. And YouTube too, but I think YouTube was doing that along with other people, so I don't think that was just specific to me. But PayPal was very specific to me. Obviously, it was like my account. I don't know why.
Wow, that is very strange.
Yeah, it is kind of strange, and maybe one day I'll find out.
Yeah.
Or maybe I won't. Anyway, thanks again.